Hello, Tony Wright, FLCC, AB Wright Ministries. We're still in this 90-day Bible study on day 57, book of Jeremiah, 33rd through the 47th chapter. As we closed yesterday, the Lord had reminded his people of a couple of things. There is nothing too hard for God, and that the Lord is good and his mercy endureth forever. I'm sure that was not only to be a boost for the people, but also for the prophet as well. Now, while he sat there in prison just for speaking the word of truth, boy, if you were charged with speaking the word of truth, would you be found guilty? Anyway, God told Jeremiah to take note of what the people were saying. Now, the people were discouraged, thinking that the people the Lord had chosen, Israel, Judah, had been completely rejected by God. Because of this, the Gentiles, they despised these chosen people of God. And because of their dejection, Jeremiah gave reassurance to the permanence of God's relationship with his people. Now, those predictions of an invasion of an enemy from the north, it would actually come to pass when Nebuchadnezzar and his multinational army began fighting against Jerusalem and against all the cities. In early 587 BC, before his confinement in the court of the guard, Jeremiah went to King Zedekiah with a message that God had declared that Jerusalem would fall to the invaders and it would be burned. And after a confrontation with Nebuchadnezzar, King Zedekiah would be carried away to Babylon. And there he would die a natural death, and fellow captives would burn incense for him and bemoan his death, just like traditional laments that they did for their culture. Now, this message to Zedekiah is during the early part of the Babylonian invasion. And already the Babylonians controlled the countryside, and there were only 2 fortified outposts beyond Jerusalem that even remained unconquered. And before he described that terrible nightmare of Jerusalem's fall, Jeremiah, he cited 3 incidents from recent history which demonstrated why Jerusalem had to be destroyed. First, during the first weeks of the siege of Jerusalem, the king and the princes, they had finally, gotten religion. And Zedekiah had entered into this sacred covenant with the inhabitants of Jerusalem to proclaim a release. And each man was to set free his Hebrew servants who had been held illegally. All who entered into that covenant, they obeyed it and they released their servants and everything. But then, when the siege was temporarily lifted in the summer of 587 BC, those princes went right back, went back on their solemn commitment, and they went right back and forced these men and women right back into slavery. Now, God's covenant with Israel required that Hebrew servants be released after 6 years of service, meaning that every 7th year they were released. And this law had been ignored by their forefathers, though. So the fact that these princes had recently, finally released their servant, it pleased the Lord. And they had actually entered into this sacred covenant, though, before the Lord in the temple. And then when these same princes reneged on this sacred oath, they had broken the oath not only for the people and the people they released, but more importantly, they broke that oath to God. Jerusalem would have to fall. The next incident that Jeremiah reminded him of took place like almost 10 years earlier, when God told Jeremiah to go to the house of the Rechabites. And he was to take this group to one of the large chambers in the temple and publicly offer them a large bowl of wine to drink. Now, God knew what their reaction would be, but he wanted Jeremiah to use this devout group as an illustration. Their ancestor Jonadab had commanded them not to drink wine forever. And the Rechabites had faithfully followed his instructions. Jonadab had spoken one time, and his descendants obeyed him for like about 200 years. But God had spoken repeatedly to Judah throughout that whole time, and Judah still refused to listen to God. And because these people had obeyed the command of their distant relative Jonadab, God promised them, Jonadab, the son of Rechab, shall not lack a man to stand before me always. But Jerusalem will have to fall. Jeremiah also referenced a scroll that was read during the reign of King Jehoiakim. Jeremiah had been told to write down all the words that God had given him concerning Israel and concerning Judah and concerning the other nation, all the other nations. And this scroll, by this time, it would contain, by this time, a summary of like 23 years of preaching, of Jeremiah's preaching. So when Jehoiakim heard about the scroll, he demanded to see it. And before 3 or 4 columns of that scroll had even been read in his presence, Jehoiakim slashed it with a scribe's knife, threw it in the fire. And after he had burned the document, Jehoiakim issued orders that Jeremiah and Baruch be seized. So God directed Jeremiah to prepare a second scroll, and that scroll was contained everything that the first one had contained. God had a special word of judgment, though, for this bold king. First, he would have no descendant to follow him successfully to the throne ever. And second was that the corpse of Jehoiakim would never even be buried. Jehoiakim, his descendants, his servants, all would be punished for his iniquity. Now, the attitude of the king toward God's written word was cited as another reason that justified, another reason why Jerusalem had to fall. Now, this section of text also contained some of the many instances that the prophet of God suffered for his testimony during the last half of this Babylonian siege. In the summer of 587 BC, the Chaldeans, they lifted the siege of Jerusalem in order to deal with some Egyptians that were marching northward to aid Zedekiah. And a 2-man delegation was sent to Jeremiah to request prayer, probably expecting, some reassurance that the Babylonian threat was over. But Jeremiah, he sent those 2 messengers back to their master with a message of doom. Pharaoh's army was going to be returned to the land of Egypt, and you could expect no help to come from the Egyptians at all. So the Chaldeans would soon return, capture Jerusalem, and destroy the city. Now, the belief that the Chaldeans would now leave Jerusalem and just leave these people alone, it was nothing but a delusion anyway. And this prophet, he would only have his freedom just a short time during that whole lull of the siege of Jerusalem before he was rearrested, and he would endure harsh treatment during the last 9 months of that siege. Jeremiah had business to conduct back in his home back in Anathoth. And then as he was leaving the city, Jeremiah was arrested and charged with treason, saying that he was going over to the Chaldeans. And this just gave the officials an excuse to vent their anger against this prophet. And he was beaten, thrown into a dungeon beneath the house of one of the scribes. And then the Chaldeans came back, just as Jeremiah had predicted. And so again, in desperation, King Zedekiah, he ordered that Jeremiah be brought to the palace. And the king secretly asked Jeremiah, "Is there a word from the Lord?" Yeah, right. No doubt the king was expecting to finally hear some positive word coming from Jeremiah about the fate of Jerusalem. No. Jeremiah replied, he didn't hesitate. He told him that indeed, yeah, there's a word from the Lord, but it wasn't the word that the king had wanted. It wasn't the word that the king had expected. As a matter of fact, the word that he was about to give him hadn't changed from all the times before. It was that he would be given into the hands of the king of Babylon. Jeremiah, he requested that he not have to go back, though, to this dungeon of Jonathan the scribe. And if the king forced that prophet to return to that dungeon, he was surely going to die. Zedekiah, though, he listened to the plea of Jeremiah, and he commanded that Jeremiah be detained in the court of the guard, which probably was like an outer area from the prison. Now, but Jeremiah's detention didn't silence him at all. Every opportunity he had, he was urging the soldiers defending the wall to surrender to the Chaldeans. And the only way that they were going to save their lives was to surrender to them. Now, anybody that remained in the city was going to die by the sword, famine, and pestilence. And Jerusalem was certainly going to be given into the hands of the Babylonians, and there was no getting around it. So Jeremiah's actions, though, it enraged the princes. These princes, they went to the king and they demanded the death penalty for this traitor Jeremiah. And in their view, he was just hurting their war effort. So the king, he actually handed Jeremiah over to these powerful princes. And they threw Jeremiah into this empty cistern, in which he sunk into the mud. It's a big water vat, basically. So an Ethiopian named Ebed Melech rushed to the palace at the Benjamin Gate where Zedekiah was sitting. And he told him about Jeremiah's plight, and he told him what the princes were doing to him. And he insisted that Jeremiah was going to die if he was left there, since there was no more bread in the city anyway. So the king, he authorized a servant to go rescue the prophet. So after Jeremiah's rescue, he just remained in detention, in the detention area known as the court of the guard, until Jerusalem fell to the Chaldeans. Now, as these siege conditions worsened, though, King Zedekiah, he sought one last time to try to get just a little glimmer of hope from a message from Jeremiah. So he ordered the prisoner to be brought back to the third entrance of the temple so that he could have this secret meeting with the king. So Zedekiah, he urged Jeremiah to not hide anything from him. And yep, indeed, in the name of God, Jeremiah gave the king two alternatives. If he surrendered to the Chaldeans, the city would be spared from destruction, and Jeremiah would live. On the other hand, if he continued to resist, the Chaldeans shortly would capture Jerusalem and burn it. Zedekiah, he would not be able to escape from their hands. It just wasn't going to happen. But fear prevented this king from following the advice of this prophet. And many Jews had already, though, defected to the Chaldeans. And they would be angry with the king for having caused the city to go through such agony and suffering. So Zedekiah, he was afraid that the Chaldeans might hand him over to his own former subjects, and they would torture him and humiliate him. And Jeremiah, he was trying to convince the king that wasn't going to happen. These fears were unfounded, but oh no. He begged the king to surrender. Oh no. Zedekiah, he ordered Jeremiah to just keep silent about the meeting. And if any of the princes questioned about what he was talking about, he was to tell them that he was petitioning the king not to have to return to the dungeon in the house of Jonathan, where he'd been in the dungeon a few weeks earlier. And sure enough, the princes, they did learn about the meeting. They asked Jeremiah what he and Zedekiah had been talking about. And Jeremiah gave them the response that the king commanded. He said that he was talking about not going back to the dungeon. He did in part. Now, in July 586, though, the walls were breached and the conquerors set up this military government. And the only remaining obstacle to them was these higher parts of the city where Zedekiah and his remnant of army soldiers were still holding out. Now, after the walls were breached, though, Zedekiah, he knew that it was just useless to try to defend the rest of the city. So King Zedekiah, he fled the city. He popped smoke and left, but he was captured over near Jericho. And then he was taken to Riblah, where Nebuchadnezzar sentenced him. And Zedekiah had to witness the execution of his own son and his own nobles before they put his eyesight out. And Nebuchadnezzar, he regarded Jeremiah, though, as being biased in favor of the Babylonians. So he gave orders that Jeremiah get favorable treatment, when all Jeremiah was doing was telling what God said. Babylon was going to take over Jerusalem. That was it. So Jeremiah was free at last. But after his rescue from the system, while Jeremiah was still confined to the court guard, he had received a special word from the Lord regarding Ebed-Melech. And Jeremiah was to go to him, tell him that although Jerusalem was about to fall to the Chaldeans, that he need not worry. Because he had actually rescued Jeremiah from what was certain death. So Ebed-Melech was promised that God would rescue him when Jerusalem fell. Now, the fact that Jeremiah included this information here is pretty much proof that Ebed-Melech was spared when Chaldeans took over Jerusalem, just like Jeremiah had predicted. Now, this tells us that God rewards those who demonstrate daring faith for him. Now, after this assassination, this was later on, there was an assassination of this guy named Gedaliah. And Jeremiah was then forced to accompany the remnant, go to Egypt. And his last recorded sermons were then on foreign soil. But he confronted the same old hypocrisy, same tendencies of idolatry that he had been speaking on before the destruction back in Jerusalem. And Jeremiah, he concluded his ministry working among those same-minded people as those that he had preached to for 40 years prior to the destruction of 586 BC. Now, by this time, he's well into his 60s. But Jeremiah had the same fire and fervor as ever before. Well, about that fire and fervor, you please keep the fire and fervor as you keep reading this word of God. And you keep checking us out on social media. And don't forget, tell your friends, tell your neighbors that FLCC is still standing on the promise. And we're taking ministry back to the first love. Peace.